So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My dad came to the United States in 1972. He grew up in India post-partition. And so he grew up in a really poor family. He lived off of rations. They didn't have running water or electricity in his house. So it's like, people like to talk about the cliche American dream story and what people started out with. My dad literally did homework by candlelight. And he came here because of the New Deal era programs, the things that President Kennedy talked about big government being aspirational and putting a man on the moon, right? That public service was something that we believed in, and that our public institutions were worth investing in, and that our public institutions, when paired with people, could help everyone get a fair shot at the middle class. So when my dad came here 45 years ago, that's the dream that he sought out. Now, and in many ways, my family's been able to experience that. But it wasn't easy. So my dad is an engineer. He's a retired engineer. He's a quality assurance engineer, so he spent a lot of time working on the factory floor. And I can tell you there were many times growing up that we had 2 really good years and then 1 really bad year. Because he would work for a company, they would send their jobs to a different state or abroad, or the jobs that were on the factory floor were automated or mechanized. And so we'd have 2 really great years, 1 really bad year. And in the mid-'80s, my dad even had to leave the country to go find work for a year before coming back, and we had to stay behind. So it wasn't always easy, but it was always aspirational. We always had a shot. And in many ways, that's what the life he was able to provide with my mom to my sister and I. And I always believe that government is aspirational and that public services, that's what we should be striving for. The idea after the Depression was to put together a coalition, because in states like Illinois, 30% of our population was unemployed. People were literally starving. And the idea was to bring people together and make government work together with people to build things, to transform communities, so that you can actually use things over multiple generations. So if you go around the country, you see that we built post offices, we helped build trails in the national parks, build the national park system. Civilian Conservation Corps did that. The Rural Electrification Administration went around the country and brought running water and power to communities. The Federal Art Administration built community art centers. There are WPA murals all over the country. The idea was that you build communities by investing in them, and by putting people back to work and building things that people actually use. Not only do you restore dignity to work, you pay a living wage, but you create the opportunity for everyone to achieve the American dream and have a fair shot at the middle class. And as a result of the New Deal programs, this country realized the greatest middle class we've ever seen. Now, over the last 40 years, after the New Deal, after the Great Society, there was this consistent drumbeat of telling people that government is the problem, that government is evil, that everything that comes from government is something that we should be suspect of. And so over time, what's happened is you get these narratives that everything government does has to do more with less, that taxing fairly and making sure the wealthy pay their fair share is the wrong thing to do because they're the only ones who create jobs, and if we help them get richer, well then they'll sprinkle some scraps on the rest of us and some of us will get ahead. None of this has ever worked. And now we've gotten to a point where we elect people who don't like government. So if you elect people who hate government, you're not going to get good government in return. So I've always believed that government is aspirational, that public service is aspirational. And so what we're pitching to you is a new deal for Illinois. It's not the New Deal, but a new deal between state government, our state government, your public institutions, and communities across Illinois. And it rests on 4 key planks. The first one is on changing our public education funding formula. Every community outside of a few enclaves in Illinois experience inequity in education. because we rely pretty much exclusively on property taxes to pay for public education, right? So if you live in a community that has a wealthier tax base, well, then you can spend what you need to spend on your schools. But everybody else in the state has to figure out how to pay for schools without taxing everyone to death. And what ends up happening is that you have these massive inequities where a few suburbs in Chicago, outside of the city of Chicago, can spend $25,000 per year for their students. And then most places in the state spend 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe a little bit more. But you can see that spending a half of what other richer communities can spend, what that means over a child's lifetime, and what that means for them in terms of outcomes in their life. So that's our first plank. The second plank is universal childcare. If we say we have family values, then we actually have to value families. And that means that we shouldn't make it more difficult for people to go to work than to stay home to raise a child. Now, if that's a decision you as a family make, where you decide to have one person stay home, that's fine. But childcare has gotten so expensive that it is basically like paying for college while your child is 0 to 4, right? How do you pay for college when you're paying college tuition from day one? So what we propose is if you make $75,000 or less, if you're solidly middle class, or you're simply getting by, or just getting by, there should be a program, a state subsidy for you to pay for childcare. And what that does for average working families across that spectrum is put more money back in people's pockets. So there's state investment on the front end, but now you have more money to actually set aside for things like a down payment on the house. It's a gender equity issue because it's primarily women who get forced out of the workplace early, right? So again, if you make the decision to do it, great. But if you are forced to leave the workplace because it's cheaper for you to stay home than to go to work, and you believe in rugged individualism, meaning that you always have to lift yourself up by your bootstraps, well, you're taking people out of the workplace early. So if you factor in the fact that women have to deal with workplace discrimination, meaning in making, in some cases, 58 cents on the dollar than a man makes, and then you take them out of the workforce early, you add up those loss of earnings over a lifetime, that's passing down wealth to your children, that's saving for college, that's buying a home, that's retirement. That's not fair. And that is certainly not how you lift all boats. So that's our second plank. The third plank is the jobs and capital bill. Now, we haven't had passed a capital bill in this state in a long time. It's time that we actually invest in communities, and invest in communities in an equitable way. So that means investing in universities, and it means investing in public schools, not just on infrastructure, but on things like the arts. That's what we did during the New Deal programs. We invested in the basic building blocks of what makes communities great, right? So whether that is a public school, a library, whether it's building new student housing, or investing in science labs at the universities. This is about making sure that communities are stable, because if you invest in the things that people use, those are the things that drive jobs, those are the things that create stability. And by the way, so when we talk about job creation, well, that's what people look for when they move their companies to a state, right? Because if a big company is moving here, they're going to have people who work for them. The people who work for them might have a family. And if they have a family, they might have children. So they want to make sure that their children go to a stable school system that's properly funded. They want to make sure that they can grow up and go to a good college, or a trade school, or vocational school. So assets like Eastern Illinois aren't and should not be seen as a drain or as a liability. There should be assets that we should be investing in. And so when I think about a jobs and capital bill, I'll think about it very much in the same way that FDR thought about it, which is we invest in things, we build things again, and we put people back to work. And the fourth plank is criminal justice reform. So it doesn't matter where you live at this point in this country, if you are poor, you are going to jail if you have a mental health issue. And people are needlessly also locked up for simply being caught with a small amount of narcotics the first or second time. You shouldn't be tagged with a scarlet letter for the rest of your life for making a mistake. And you certainly shouldn't be in prison for a mental health issue. a public health issue. These are things that have to change. So I'm unapologetic about going big. I think we have to. I think what ends up happening is if you look at the temperature at the national level and you look at what's happening around the country, this is a result of people not feeling like they can get ahead. And that's when you start looking at other communities as the other. Well, you live in Chicago, so you're bad because you're taking things away from me. Or you're Muslim, so it's your fault that things are not going my way. This is what happens when it's really hard for working people to get ahead. So I'm going to leave you with a couple things. In order to do these things, we have to make sure that the wealthy pay their fair share. And wealth is fine. I don't envy wealth. I don't hate wealth. I think people who are wealthy are not all bad people. But I think fundamentally as a society, we have to stop worshiping wealth. Because where we are today is we think that wealth is the only pre-qualifier to run for public office. And what ends up happening when you do that is that people sometimes bring a very myopic view to government. Because sometimes when you're so wealthy, you don't know what normal people have to go through, right? And you don't know why normal people need government. And so it's okay if you're not wealthy. It's okay because success doesn't mean and wealth aren't necessarily tied to one another. The second thing is we have to think about what it means to be working people. Because all we do at the bottom is fight over scraps. So when I think about redefining this conversation, so we can talk about progressive taxation and equity and fairness, the way I think about it is this. If you go to work every day, and whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a carpenter, a plumber, or you work in a fast food restaurant, if a majority of your income comes from going to work, then you're a working person. That's not to say that there might be someone at the very higher ends over here that might need to pay a little bit more. But you're a working person, up and down the spectrum. But if a majority of your income comes from your money making you money, that's fine too. God bless you. But you have a tax system and a structure that's in place that makes it virtually impossible for everyone over here to get ahead because you pay just a fraction of what everyone else does. That's the inequity and the fairness that we need to resolve. And the way we get that is by having an honest conversation. But keeping us fighting over scraps, that's by design. That's how nothing at the top ever changes, because we split ourselves off at the bottom. That's how people making, 200,000 fight people who make 150,000, 100 versus 80, 80 against 60 and all the way down. Because it's easy to look down at the person making slightly less than you and say, I went to school. Why are you making almost as much as I do? I know I work really hard. Or looking at the person just one rung above you and think, I know I work harder than that person. And I don't understand why they make so much more than I do. We're all in the same boat. And I think the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we can start resolving some of the problems that impact every community in Illinois. So with that, it has truly been an honor, but I want to also leave as much time as possible to answer questions, comments, and more importantly, we're here to hear from you and just to listen. So thank you so much. Who wants to go first?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about, what you plan to do for, funding? You're talking about a new deal, as far as what the future looks like for a lot of universities that are lacking funding.
Okay, that's a great question. She asked about funding, right? So when we talk about progressive taxes and revenue, we have to recognize, A, that Illinois is the 5th largest economy in the country. It's an economy that's $700 billion. Bigger than most economies of countries from around the world. So despite what everyone tells you and what the governor tells you that everything is broken and everything is terrible, it's just not true. There is a lack of political will to face voters and just simply tell the truth, right? So when I think about funding, it means recognizing that we need to have a progressive income tax. And that means that, like at the federal level, the more you make, the more you pay. But you also make sure you hold most people harmless. And that's what most states do. We're one of a few states in the country that has a flat income tax. And what that means is We're one of a few states, we're almost dead last in what we spend on public education. So when you tax on a flat basis, all the working people that I talked about pay the same rate. And the offensive part about that is, you have people, like I use Ken Griffin as an example, he makes $50 million a month. Good for him. I don't have a problem with that. But when he pays 3.75% on those taxes, the same rate that someone making $30,000 a year pays, that's offensive. And that needs to change. And that's all we're simply fighting for, which is all of the things that we were able to achieve as a country during the New Deal were a result of just creating fairness. This idea that there needs to be a balance between government and business, and that business doesn't always control everything. Business isn't the enemy. It just means that we have to have a balance. And so if we had a more progressive, a fair tax in this state, there are things we can invest in Eastern Illinois and SIU. I know what's happening with the budget crisis. I don't look at universities as a liability. I look at universities as the economic engines of the communities, but also as a pathway to the American dream for students around the state. And so you can't starve them and expect them to perform. You have to invest in them if you want them to do well. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that question. Oh, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago, Ralph Mortieri was here from the Center for Budget and Tax Accountability. And he was here a couple of years ago, and one of the points he made a couple of years ago is what you're making right now. He said, we really need to have a fair tax system, et cetera, and all the good reasons for it. In this latest talk that he gave, he said, I'm not very optimistic about the future of a fair tax system because it requires a change in the Constitution of Illinois. And he said that didn't happen when the Democrats controlled the governorship in both chambers of the legislature. There was no appetite for it. Certainly there's no appetite for it with the Republicans. I just don't hold out much hopes for that kind of change. But I do think that even a regressive tax, a raise in the regressive tax, actually helps the bottom rungs more than what they would actually have to put into it, even though it is regressive. And so he said, that's at least a step towards trying to ameliorate some of the problems of revenue in the state of Illinois. And then what we could do from there on was tinker with the tax system so that it did actually benefit more than it does right now, the lower tiers, but we do raise the regressive tax system a little bit. He said 1-2%, bring it up to about 5%, he said, and of course, and then tax the service industry.
Yeah. So part of this is having the conversation, right? So there is a different way to do it. Senator Don Harmon out of Oak Park has a bill where it's essentially a progressive income tax without changing the Constitution. And what it does is it raises the rate, but builds in higher exemptions. So that's a way to get at it. But you know what that means is people like me, if we're elected, we have to then face those commercials and the mail pieces that you get that some consultant writes and says, Pawar wants to raise taxes by X%, right? That's what you need, but to me, that's a very cheap tactic. My job is to go out and actually have this conversation so that when those mail pieces come, we know better than the buying internet. The time bomb, the people talk about fraud and corruption and waste in government. Look, I know, I'm from Chicago, and people always make being an alderman, that I'm an alderman, as a pejorative. There are people who cheat everywhere, but the institution isn't bad. There are people who cheat in the private sector. That doesn't make every private sector company evil. The conversation that we haven't had, this is also true in Chicago. I'll give you a Chicago example. We sold off our parking meters 8 years ago, right? We no longer own our parking meters in Chicago. We sold it to a foreign conglomerate because we were charging basically like a dime every 15, 20 minutes, right? Basically nothing to park on the streets, not enforcing it. The thought was, we didn't want to raise the rates on parking because we were worried about the next election. Because the thought was, well, if we raise parking rates, someone's going to write a mail piece or make a call to someone's house and say, don't vote for this person because they raised the parking fees by X. So what we did was the city sold them off. They got $1 billion for it. But they just took $1 billion and just spent it in the matter of a few years because they didn't want to be honest with taxpayers about saying, here's our deficit. And here's our, and we're, instead of telling people that we need to raise more revenue to actually pay for government, they just papered over that. It's like selling your watch to pay your water bill. You know, you get the one-time revenue, but you don't actually do anything with it. There's no plan for it. The problem with doing that over time is that you keep telling people you're going to do more with less, then you do less with less, and then you have to raise taxes. So the fraud, waste, and corruption that I see that's pervasive in government is certainly true in the city of Chicago. Certainly has been true at the state and federal level, is that people like me never come to you and say, listen, over the next 15 years, the costs are going to go up, but we need to provide services. And that means over time, there's going to be incremental increases. But we can build that in so you can prepare. But also, we can make sure that businesses prepare and make sure that it aligns with wages and make sure that you're not dinging people all at once. But instead of doing that, it's just thinking about the next election and making sure that you can stand up and say, I didn't do anything. I never raised anything. But that over time is so dishonest because here we are today. And we're in a place today where you're upset about the services you receive. Universities are struggling to stay afloat. And then people like me have to come and tell you, I'm sorry, there has to be a progressive income tax. I can see how that's frustrating. But we don't come out from underneath it without trying to look back at how we actually got here. Yeah.
How much of a progressive voice do you see the Democrats in Illinois have right now? Because obviously there's some divergence within the party about what is the proper tactic to approach this bigger problem. So you're coming from obviously a very progressive notion of, you know, changing the way we tax people's income, changing the way we fund schools. That's not always popular even within the Democratic Party. So how do you see, you know, the Democrats being the majority in Illinois and being the flag bearers of progressive ideas? How do we move this conversation forward?
So it starts by first recognizing that, so when I first ran for office in 2011 in Chicago, so I beat the machine in 2011. I was not endorsed by anyone, I didn't have any money, and I didn't have the resources to buy the database which tells you who the strong Democrats are. So we just knocked on every door. Obviously I can't knock on every door in Illinois. But the one thing I learned in 2011, because I didn't have money, was that you don't write people off because of what they pulled at the ballot box the last election. Is that you go face them, you go talk to them, and you make your pitch. And sometimes you get a door slam in your face. Sometimes people aren't interested. And sometimes they'll just tell you, I'm not gonna vote for you, I don't support what you believe. But at a minimum, you had an interaction with that person, and they can say, you know what, I don't agree with this person, but they showed up. And so my perspective is, I'm really not interested in just looking at the just what's going on within the Democratic Party. I'm more interested in presenting a vision. We have to recognize that beating Bruce Rauner means acknowledging that he has a bold vision. It only serves 3 people, his 3 big donors. But it's bold. And you don't beat a vision by simply saying we don't like him or that he's wrong. You beat someone with a bold vision by having a counterbalance. And that means 1, presenting that vision, but 2, going out and talking to people, whether or not they agree with you. Because it's incumbent on public servants to go out and sell that. Because after the election, it doesn't really matter whether you vote a Democrat or Republican. It's time to govern. And so my perspective is we're going to go to all 102 counties and make this same pitch, not change it based on who we're talking to. This is who we are. This is what I stand for. But I want to hear your input, and let's see if we can work together. I think we can all recognize that we experience inequity in education, that it's really hard to find quality childcare, that there are lots of communities in this state that have not been invested in properly, whether it's basic issues like water main infrastructure or public schools or libraries or roads. Everyone knows these issues exist and everyone experiences them. So that's not a Democratic or Republican issue. So my perspective is sell the vision, to everybody, and not write people off based on whether the county's red or blue. In the back.
As governor in the current national climate, you're going to be faced with fighting and doing battle with Trump's ideas, divisiveness, immigration, deportation, just general inequalities. What can you say about that?
I mean, I think that is where, if we buy into that, we're just going to keep fighting over scraps. That's the MO there, which is you divide people based on, where they live, what they look like, what religion they observe. That is never a way to unite people. And that's the thing about FDR that I thought was incredible. Is that he built the most unlikely coalition this country has ever seen, because the idea was you invest in people. Look, we all have our inherent biases. We're human beings, right? But as adults, you set those things aside and you don't react to your most base instincts. But we all have our biases. But you set those aside and you recognize that I believe most people are just good people, that they want to provide for their families, they want to send their kids to good schools, and they want stability and some certainty. That's all. And I think if you do that, you don't have people running into the arms of a demagogue. I think people only do that when they're suffering. That's not to say, and quite frankly, when I think about the president, I think it's just one person. It's not the entire Republican Party, because I think there are good people in the Republican Party. And I think people like me force you to choose come election time to pick one, right? But I don't think most people get up every day and look in the mirror and say, I'm a Republican or a Democrat. I just don't think that happens. But I think when you have someone who's dividing people, then we become divided, then we become identified, and we identify one another based on who we voted for. That's a race to the bottom. And that, I think, can only be fought by coming together and recognizing that equity is more important, and that government isn't always terrible, that it's done some good things in the past, it is aspirational. And that when we came together 70 years ago, we did great things for this country. And we can do it again. It's just a matter of not dividing ourselves at the bottom.
Yeah, it's hard to know how much of the Affordable Care Act is going to remain, but had you been governor several years ago, what would your approach have been to establishing state exchanges in Illinois or ceding to the federal government? And what would your opinion have been about Medicaid expansion?
I mean, I'm for Medicaid expansion. I think the issue with the Affordable Care Act is that, we're all going to experience something at one point in our lives. And so I look at Medicaid expansion, the Affordable Care Act, as this contract between you and I. I may be healthy today, but that may not always be the case. It's the same thing with, say, senior housing or Social Security. It's, if we're lucky, one day we're all going to grow old and live a long life. But that means we all have a responsibility that today, when you're young, you contribute to a system so that someone benefits today, but so that system's there when you're older. It's the same thing with Medicaid expansion. Is that, there are lots of things that make, when you think about different issues related to health that impact communities, there's a relationship between high levels of poverty and heart disease and diabetes, right? We know that because when you're barely getting by or you're poor, you're also making different choices about what you eat and what you put in your body. And so if we're thinking about making for more healthy communities, then we have to expand healthcare options for people who don't necessarily have the best options to begin with. But then also at the same time, invest in communities so that we're reducing poverty over time and creating more opportunity. So if you want to reduce healthcare costs, then you have to increase opportunity for people. Because health outcomes and economic outcomes are linked.
maybe you touched on this, I'm sorry I came in late, but I want to talk about your first plank. The funding formula, how to fix it. The commission the governor appointed, in their report, recommended the evidence-based model, but when they ran the simulations, they found that downstate rural communities like Charleston, Mattoon, would take as much as 18 years to reach even an adequate level of funding. So how do you address the flaws that, at least on the surface, seem, like they're just over the horizon? There's no.
We know that it costs more money in services to educate kids in schools where you have high levels of poverty. That's the truth. And that means you have to spend more. So equity doesn't always mean equal. Equity means spending money where it's most needed. And equity means spending money in communities that have been left behind. And that is true of lots of communities around the state where the property tax base or the sales tax base or both has dwindled because the company has left, or because the company left and then nothing was done about it over 20, 25 years. Those are the kinds of communities. It's not just urban areas like the south or west side of Chicago. It's also true in places like East St. Louis and Rockford, Peoria, in places where big institutions or big employers have left and the state did nothing about lifting all boats over time. So those are the places where you need to invest more heavily. And that also means that the pie can't be chopped up differently. The pie has to be bigger, right? The pie has to be bigger, which means you need a bigger revenue stream. And that's where, again, where we come back to how we structure our tax system, which is state.
So holding harmless is still part of that.
I mean, I think the best way to get at more equity in the near term is holding harmless because I don't know that you necessarily do the right thing by taking money from one school district to give to another from a property tax perspective, at least right away, because you're still penalizing one district over the next, right? And I think if one school district can spend $20,000 a year, my perspective is that's great because they're children and they deserve that. The question is, how do we get everyone else to that level?
I'm sorry to tack on about this, but one opportunity that some school districts have, school districts like Charleston, is to borrow money from the more affluent areas with tax-assured warrants against their local revenue streams. The state allows this, and it's like it's incentivizing bad behavior. It rewards affluent districts for being
Affluent.
Yeah, and they kind of figure that in to their budget process, that we're going to issue this much in loans to the rest of the state, and we can count on that as an additional funding stream. Do you think that there's a solution there, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where it becomes about scraps, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's clawing after a tiny few resources because at the top we're not doing anything substantive about making sure that there's more money available for everybody. And I think that's how some of these practices at the local level stop. So when you think about the property tax freeze that the governor talks about, like, I understand what he's trying to get at. But if you freeze property taxes, which is the only lever most local governments have to pay for schools, and then are totally unwilling to talk about making the tax system fair with income, you're just starving everybody. And again, like I said before, if you keep asking people to do more with less, eventually you do less with less. And that's why people leave the state. So we were in the Quad Cities a few weeks ago, right? And so Davenport is growing. It's just over the bridge, right? And there's this talk of, the Illinois Policy Institute wrote this article recently about people just going over the bridge. Right? You might work at John Deere in Illinois, but then you go over the bridge to Davenport. So why is Illinois shrinking? This scathing review of what's happening in Illinois. But the truth is, you cross that bridge, it's not like it's some tax haven or job creating haven in Davenport. Their tax rate is almost triple ours at the very high end, meaning for the very wealthiest, because they have a progressive tax rate. And guess what they can do? They pay for their schools. There isn't uncertainty. And what there isn't over there is constant chaos. That's what people want. And so they're not fleeing because Illinois is so terrible, it's such a bad place to live. They're fleeing because we have leadership that's not willing to look at equity in terms of what makes communities strong. And I've always believed that public schools, public institutions like libraries, like universities, these institutions are what make communities thrive over the long term. They're what give people opportunities. That's what drives economic development. Because ultimately we're talking about people, and people rely on these services.
Kind of to follow up with, I forgot who asked the question about Trump, but he talked a little bit about, bringing in the feds in Chicago, talking about criminal activity, and you talked a little bit about criminal justice reform. I guess what are your, I don't know if you laid out what specifically your plan was, but what are your ideas on that?
So on criminal justice reform, if narcotics possession, I don't think whether, a young person gets up in the morning one day and decides, I have all these opportunities, but you know what, I'm going to go and start selling drugs. People don't make decisions like that unless they have access to formal opportunities. And when you don't have access to the formal economy, that's when people do other things. And so when a young person's arrested with drugs, there should be an adult diversion program. There needs to be proper social services, mental health services in communities. So I'll give you an example on mental health. My in-laws practice mental health law in Chicago. And one thing they tell me over and over again, it's hard to find a psychiatrist south of I-80. In the same way it's hard to find primary care doctors in smaller communities, it's hard to find mental health services south of I-80. So imagine now if you have communities where you have high levels of poverty, people are suffering, mental illness goes along with that, and people don't get the services that they need and frankly deserve because there's a lack of access. And you let that community just sit there without any intervention over time. What do you think happens? There's the introduction of drugs. So whether you look at urban areas with heroin addiction or small communities with opiates, the problems are the same. It's a lack of investment. And so it's not just diversion programs. It's not just sentencing reform. It's not just making sure that we're not sending people to jail for mental health or substance abuse issues. It's also creating opportunity in communities. So I'll give you an example. There's a lot of talk of Flint, Michigan, right? And about lead in the water. But we have communities like that in Illinois right now, whether it's East St. Louis or even in parts of Chicago. Actually, many communities are in Illinois. You can zoom into communities that have been struggling and on a Google map, and imagine taking the top layer off and looking underground. There are lots of communities where you have water mains that are 120, 130 years old. And in those old water mains, there's lead. And we know that if you live in a community that has old water mains, there's a good chance that that community is also poor. And when those poor kids drink water with lead in it, they're more prone to violent behavior as they grow into young adults. Because there's a link between your brain development and taking in lead as a young child. So when you think about solving problems holistically, that's where the capital bill comes in, is that you have to go around the state and actually invest in communities on water infrastructure, and not just building schools or resurfacing roads, but actually looking at everything from a holistic perspective. So it's not just about diversion programs, because that's when things have already gone horribly wrong. It's about also addressing the root cause. And believe it or not, there are a lot of communities that have been left behind in this way. This is an American problem, right? So I know this because my background is in emergency management and disaster planning. And so the Department of Homeland Security since 9/11 has been issuing report after report on the status of the state of our infrastructure around the country. And most of our water infrastructure, our roads and bridges get failing grades because we built these things at a time where we believed in investing in the country and investing in one another. And then over the last 40 years, we decided that the best way to invest in one another is to just help a few people get ahead so they can sprinkle some scraps on the rest of us. And as a result of that, we haven't invested in our communities. And so when we think about national security and we think about all these other risks, that's why we get failing grades, because we just haven't invested in ourselves. And that means, again, just normal people deciding that they need government to work for normal people and not just a few.
Back to practical stuff, the grand bargain, what's left of the to your understanding, what's left of the turnaround agenda and what's on the table, what's being taken away? Or
I don't know. I mean, it's a moving goalpost.
Okay.
My sense is that, and even at this point, the governor now does not want a grand bargain. I think he wants to own the term grand bargain and say that he's going out, and he's for it. But every day, his goals change and what he wants. So like term limits, for example, guys. I term limited myself. I'm not running for alderman again. No matter what happens here, I'm not. If I'm not the nominee or if I don't win this race for governor, I'm not running for alderman. I believe it was important to term limit myself because it set an expiration date for myself. So it made me, for myself, work that much harder based on things that I care about. But if you term limit everybody, it's not a panacea. Do you want, the question that you all need to decide, and it's a debate worth having, do you want powerful politicians or powerful bureaucrats? Do you want someone that you can go to, show up at events like this, push them on issues, or are you going to defer everything to someone in a downtown office somewhere? They're both different solutions. They're not panaceas. They don't solve everything. They're trade-offs to each one. This is a conversation worth having. And certainly, maybe one we need to put on the ballot. At the end of the day, though, the idea that term limits gets job creators excited is so absurd. It's offensive. And so these are great talking points that he puts out, but it's all politics, no governing. And here's a couple realities that I didn't get to, if you'll indulge me for a minute. There's another wave of automation coming. 10 years or less. Trucking is going to be automated. So if you are primarily middle-aged men without a college degree, that is your ticket to the middle class. If it's the easiest way, is to drive for a living. And these are solid jobs. But it's not just the drivers, it's the people that work at the truck stops and the motels and all the other industries that support trucking. All of this is going to be automated in 10 years or less. We're watching it happen. It's not science fiction. So what's going to happen is you're going to have lots of really cheap products because the cost to move things from point A to point B are going to be a lot less because you're getting rid of all these jobs. And you're going to have lots of people that are out of work. And so that's a scary scenario if we don't prepare for that future. Because if you think it's scary now, wait until that happens and we haven't done anything about it. Young people, I see people graduating from college, taking on huge amounts of debt to go to school, to do the right thing. They graduate, and then they delay other life decisions because of the amount of student loans they have. So you have all these young people who did the right thing, who are moving out of their house later, parents' house later, or they're renting longer, they're not buying homes, or they're waiting longer to buy a home, and in some cases waiting longer to settle down if that's what they choose to do. And so we're seeing projected birth rates go down, right? Because they're not also deciding to have kids at the same rate. That's a problem for society because you want people to have the option of starting a family if they want to, if that's what they choose to do. You don't want to, as a country, end up like Japan, where you have lots of educated people making solid wages, but it's really expensive to live there, and so they don't have as many children. And Japan's looking at a demographic crisis, like now, because they don't have enough young people. So these are all things that we should be thinking about. So the turnaround agenda does nothing to address the next wave of automation or what young people have to go through. And so for young people, one of the things we're proposing as part of the New Deal is to refinance student loans using the state's authority. So what we'll do is say, we'll give you a 200 basis point discount, so 2%. And we'll eat that cost as a state in exchange for 10 years in Illinois. So I feel like if you go to college and you take it on student loans, we'll refinance them for you at a cheaper rate than the feds can give you, putting more money back into your pocket, right, in exchange for 10 years. And so if we can get you here at 22 or 23 and keep you here till 33 or 34, we probably are keeping you for good, right? The hope is that you'll settle down. You add that with childcare subsidies. Well, now you've made it possible for these young people to have a significant more amount of money in their pockets than they would have had if they lived somewhere else. That is how you grow the population. Term limits, gutting people's wages, that does nothing for that. So that's why I think having a vision is more important than simply relying on politics and pitting one group against another. There's one more. We'll do two. We'll do two. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just wondered how you felt about the idea of free community college that some states have pursued.
I think it's great. I absolutely support it. And in Chicago, we've started that path, right? In Chicago, we have the STAR Scholarship, where if you graduate from a CPS, a Chicago Public School, with a 3.0 or above, that you have free tuition. And I think it's time to make sure that we expand that as well. So I think community college, we have to expand the MAP grant first, and then work towards free community college. And Will Guzzardi, who's a state rep, is working on free tuition universally. So there's good stuff happening in that space. New York just did that, by the way. Yeah.
I actually had a two-parter.
Yeah.
One, is there anything in the turnaround agenda around our sticking points that you would adapt if you were governor? And two, I guess, where do you kind of put the blame in the current budget impasse, which at this point could probably last until his entire term?
First question, items I agree with. I don't think term limits in the executive is a bad thing. I think turnover in the executive branch is something we should do. I don't think term limits on legislative leadership is a bad thing. But fundamentally on term limits across the board, that's a conversation that we all should have as a state and really just think through the consequences. It's not a panacea. So there's one. I think that's about where it stops. I just don't, gutting people's wages, workman's comp, he talked a lot about that. What he really wants, so in Illinois, if you get hurt on the job, based on your injury, you have a set number of dollars you get, right? That's good because it doesn't force working people to file a lawsuit, find a lawyer, go to court, and then spend years in court fighting some big corporation. What he wants to do is go to other states where you have to file a lawsuit, find someone who will take your case, and then suffer through however many years before you get a settlement. Because what ends up happening is, look, I understand why you need to cut the cost for small businesses. But I'm also tired of you watching big businesses use small businesses as a pawn to prevent any real reform. Because what ends up happening is, it's big business that wants you to file a lawsuit. Because they'll always have more money than you for legal fees. So they'll wait you out. Or they'll wait until something terrible happens to you, or you quit, or you just give up. That's what he wants with workman's comp reform. So on the surface, he'll say, well, if we just simply do this, the state's going to be, we're going to create so many more jobs. It's just not true. Yes, our costs in some respect might be higher, but there's also more certainty. And that's good for small business. The only people who benefit from going the other way are the biggest corporations who want to tie you up in court because it's a lot cheaper for them to tie you up in court because they have more money for lawyers than a small business who's like, okay, I'm going to pay insurance, I'm going to pay a premium. If you get hurt on the job, you have a defined benefit. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think we need to pick apart and ask more tough questions because he's done a really good job of framing the issues. But it's all politics. There's no governing behind it. Thank you. So before we go, if you're interested in our campaign, check us out at pawar2018.com. It's PAWAR2018.com. We've had about 600 people sign up, to volunteer on our campaign around the state for the last few weeks. I know I'm not going to be the wealthy candidate on either side of the race, but it's important to have vision, and I think that's what's going to win this race. I don't think it's just money. We obviously have to raise money, so if you're interested, please do. But I don't think self-funding and just simply having the most money means that you're going to have the winning ticket. I just don't buy that. So with that, I hope you'll get involved. And if I'm not the person that you want to support, then we need to push the candidate that you do support to embrace a real vision. Thank you.